Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're taking a journey that starts a long way from the usual intellectual centers you might think of. We're not in Rome, not in Athens.
No, we are dropping ourselves right into the heart of 12th century Al-Andalus, what we now call Spain.
Specifically into Cordoba. And at this time, Cordoba was this just bustling, brilliant center of learning. It's really where Western Europe first started to rediscover its own classical roots.
And our focus is on a monumental figure, a man whose authority became so immense in Europe that he was known simply by a title, the Commentator.
We're talking about Abu al-Walid Muhammad ibn Ahmad ibn Rushd.
Better known to the Latin West, of course, as Averroes.
And when we say he was a polymath, we truly mean it. Our sources are just filled with awe at the variety of fields he was proficient in. We're talking philosophy, medicine, law, astronomy, physics.
Right, this wasn't a man who just, dipped his toe into a few subjects.
Not at all.
He mastered them, all of them. He was, in a very real sense, a kind of universal genius, but born 4 centuries before the Renaissance really got going.
Absolutely. So the mission of this deep dive is to unpack the story behind these grand titles. We want to reveal how this Andalusian scholar became the definitive authority on Aristotle for both Christian and Jewish Europe.
And why he's so often called the father of rationalism. We'll also dig into how his really radical defensive reason led to his own books being burned on the caliph's orders in his own lifetime.
It's an incredible story of intellectual rigor versus, political reality. But before we jump in, let's just clarify the names. Because for a deep dive, clarity is everything.
Good idea. Ibn Rushd is his original Arabic name. Averroes is simply the Latinization.
And that probably came from how it was pronounced in Spain, right?
It's believed so, yeah.
Mhm.
The Ibn prefix can sound a bit like oven or abin in Spanish pronunciation, and from there it's a short hop to Averroes.
But whether you call him Ibn Rushd or Averroes, those titles are what really matter. The commentator for his just unparalleled analysis of Aristotle.
And father of rationalism for making the audacious claim that philosophical reason isn't just, compatible with faith, but that it's actually a religious obligation.
That really sets the stage. Let's start by walking through the high-stakes, politically charged life that he lived. So Averroes was born in Cordoba in 1126. And this wasn't a humble beginning.
Not at all. His family was already deeply, deeply rooted in public service, especially in the legal establishment. They were, you could say, legal royalty.
And not just any legal family. His grandfather was a massive figure in the city.
A huge figure. He served as the chief judge, the Qadi of Cordoba, and at the same time, he was the imam of the Great Mosque. This was under the previous dynasty, the Almoravids.
So to be born into that family, it meant he was basically destined for the highest levels of religious and legal authority.
Exactly. And that context is so vital because it completely shaped his education. He received what the sources call an excellent traditional education, which meant a deep, deep immersion in the Islamic sciences.
So what did that entail specifically?
Yeah. It meant studying fiqh, which is jurisprudence, hadith, the traditions of the Prophet Muhammad, and of course theology. Specifically, he was part of the Maliki school of law, which was the dominant legal tradition in Al-Andalus.
And the sources even mentioned he memorized Imam Malik's Muwatta.
Yes, which is this enormous collection of legal traditions. Memorizing it it's a monumental feat. It shows his mastery of traditional Islamic law was absolutely complete.
So he was a superstar jurist, just waiting to happen. But the thing that really defined him, the thing that created all that tension later in his life, was that he didn't stop there.
That's the crucial hinge. He didn't just accept the traditional curriculum. He aggressively pursued what were called the sciences of the ancients, Greek philosophy, mathematics, medicine, science.
He wanted both worlds.
He insisted on both worlds. He sought out the works of Greek thinkers and their Muslim predecessors. We know for a fact he studied the works of Ibn Bajjah, who was also known as Ibn Pace.
And he was one of the earliest advocates for a pure form of Aristotelianism in the region, right?
That's right. So this means Averroes was completely fluent in the language of sacred texts and in the language of cutting-edge rational philosophy. He could code switch between them perfectly.
And that dual fluency put him on the map very, very quickly. By 1153, he's already in Marrakesh,
Which was the capital of the powerful Almohad Empire at the time. And he's not there as a tourist. He's engaged in advanced scientific work, specifically astronomical observations.
What was he trying to do?
His goal was incredibly ambitious. He was trying to find the physical laws that govern the movement of the planets and stars. It was this early, bold attempt to reconcile the mathematical models of the cosmos.
Like Ptolemy's.
Exactly, with the physical reality described by Aristotle. Now, the sources say this particular research program didn't succeed, but it really highlights his commitment to physical science and observation from an early age.
But the real game changer for his career came through a friendship. He connects with the philosopher and court physician Ibn Tufayl.
And that relationship led to his famous introduction to the ruling caliph, Abu Yaqub Yusuf, around the year 1169. This is the moment where his academic knowledge becomes a major political asset, and, well, later a liability.
Right, and that initial meeting is just this classic anecdote. It perfectly illustrates the tightrope walk of being an intellectual in the caliph's court.
It does. The caliph, who really prided himself on his own learning, asks Averroes a question that was just explosive in theological circles.
He asks him whether the heavens were created in time or if they had existed eternally.
Let's just pause on that. That was not a casual question.
No.
That was the central charge of heresy leveled against philosophers by the Orthodox theologians. To answer eternal meant you were denying God's absolute creative power over time itself. It was a potential death sentence.
So how did Averroes handle it?
He was initially very cautious. The sources say he sensed the danger and just stayed silent. But the caliph was persistent. And then he did something amazing. He started showcasing his own deep knowledge of the subject.
He wasn't just testing it.
No, he was inviting him into a real discussion. He started talking about the views of Plato, Aristotle, and other Muslim thinkers on this very topic. He proved he wasn't trying to trap Averroes, but that he genuinely wanted to explore the question.
Which must have put Averroes at ease.
Yeah.
He realized he was in the company of a genuine, philosophically minded patron.
Completely. And so he then proceeded to explain his own nuanced position, which impressed the caliph immensely. Averroes later remarked that the caliph had, and I'm quoting here, a profuseness of learning I did not suspect.
That's the ultimate academic seal of approval.
And that one meeting secured his entire career trajectory. See, the caliph had complained to Ibn Tufayl before about how difficult Aristotle's original texts were. Too dense, too complex.
So the caliph then commissioned Averroes to write clear, accessible commentaries, to basically unlock Aristotle's wisdom for him and for the court.
Talk about a mandate. And the rewards came almost immediately. In 1169, Averroes is appointed Qadi judge in Seville. 2 years later, in 1171, he's appointed Qadi back in his hometown of Córdoba.
And during this period, he's just unbelievably productive. He's a judge, he's traveling, but he's also writing constantly.
The sources show it was a period of intense productivity. He's writing philosophy, law, and medicine, all while holding down this very demanding public office. And his rise just continued. In 1182, he succeeds his friend Ibn Tufayl as the court physician.
And later that same year, he gets the ultimate family honor.
He's appointed chief Qadi of Córdoba, the exact same prestigious office his grandfather had held.
He's at the absolute pinnacle of power, of scholarship, of royal favor for more than a decade. But we know how these stories go. The political winds can shift violently.
And they did. The sources tell us his fortunes reversed, just dramatically, around 1195 under the new caliph, Abu Yusuf Yaqub.
It was a sudden and shocking fall from grace.
Completely. Averroes faced charges, a tribunal was held in Córdoba, his teachings were formally condemned, and his philosophical works were ordered to be collected and burned in public.
And he was banished.
He was banished to Lucena, a city near Córdoba. It served as a sort of temporary exile.
That's the ultimate irony, isn't it? The man who was commissioned by the caliphate to clarify philosophy is now condemned by that same caliphate for his philosophical views. Why? Why the sudden shift?
Well, modern historians are pretty clear on this. It was less about a genuine intellectual change of heart from the caliph and more about cold, hard political maneuvering.
Okay, so what was the political situation?
The caliph was locked in a fierce existential war against the Christian kingdoms in the north of the Iberian Peninsula. And to rally the populace to maintain morale and unity, he desperately needed the support of the Orthodox religious establishment.
The ulema, the religious scholars.
Exactly. And the ulema had always seen Averroes' brand of radical rationalism as deeply, deeply threatening to their authority.
Because he was challenging their methods, their right to be the sole interpreters of Scripture.
Precisely. So by publicly condemning Averroes, by burning his books and banishing him, the caliph was performing a very calculated political act. He was sacrificing his star philosopher to appease the powerful traditional religious bloc whose support he needed to win the war.
So philosophy was a luxury. It was fine when the court was stable and curious, but when political survival was on the line, the rationalist had to go.
It truly just underscores the fragility of intellectual freedom when it clashes with state power. Now, he was eventually recalled to court in Marrakesh shortly before he died in 1198, which suggests the political pressures had eased up. But the damage was done. And the incident just stands as this potent symbol of the tension between reason and traditional authority.
Okay, so moving from his life to his work, the sheer volume it's almost unbelievable. Our sources say over 100 books and treatises.
And covering a wider array of subjects than any of his predecessors. But the reason we call him the Commentator, the reason he has that singular title, is Aristotle.
His dedication to Aristotle was total. I mean, he took on this monumental task of commenting on nearly all of Aristotle's surviving works.
Right. And as you noted, the only major exception was Aristotle's Politics, which for whatever reason had been lost to the Islamic world at that time.
But since politics was unavailable, Averroes didn't just ignore political science. He found a substitute, a pretty major one.
He did. He wrote comprehensive commentaries on Plato's The Republic instead. He used it as the foundational text for political science, and then he synthesized Plato's political framework with the concept of the ideal Islamic state, which had to be based on Sharia law.
That ability to adapt and fill in these huge intellectual gaps really speaks volumes about his scholarly drive.
It really does.
So let's dive into the commentaries themselves. This is really where he organizes his legacy. And he wrote 3 distinct types for different purposes.
Yes, these 3 levels of commentary were tailored to different audiences and different needs. The first level were the short commentaries, or the jami.
And these were for beginners.
Essentially.
Yeah.
They were simple, straightforward summaries of the doctrines, probably written early in his career, intended for students or anyone who just needed a quick reference, a sort of Aristotle for dummies, if you will.
Okay, and the next level up, this was probably the most important one for the caliph who commissioned him, the middle commentaries.
The talkies. And yes, these were the paraphrases. They were designed specifically to clarify and simplify the original Aristotelian texts. These were the works meant to solve the caliph's frustration, to make dense philosophy accessible to an educated layman, to the court.
So they summarized the arguments without getting bogged down in all the tiny textual disputes.
Exactly. But then you have the third level. The truly defining works, the ones that earned him that singular title, the Commentator, in the West. The long commentaries, the tafsir or the shar.
And these were a completely different beast.
A completely different beast. These were massive, line-by-line, exhaustive analyses. They would include the complete original text of Aristotle, and then that would be followed by Averroes' extensive dissection, his comparison of different interpretations, and his defense of the ideas.
So definitely not for a general audience.
No, these were meant for serious, advanced scholars, and they contain the highest degree of Averroes' own original philosophical thought.
And his mission within all these commentaries wasn't just to explain Aristotle. It was, as he saw it, to purify him. He wanted to restore the philosophy to its original teachings. Why did he feel Aristotle needed purifying?
Because he believed that the previous and hugely influential Muslim philosophers, specifically Al-Farabi and most importantly Avicenna, had corrupted Aristotle. They had woven in Neoplatonic concepts that he felt had no place there.
Okay, let's slow down here because this is where the philosophical nuance is critical. What exactly did Neoplatonism inject into the conversation that Averroes found so distasteful?
The primary injection was the doctrine of emanation. Now, Aristotle's physics explained the world through, change, movement, causation, things you can observe, but not through a kind of flowing hierarchical process of creation.
So what is emanation?
Emanation, as Avicenna adopted it, proposed that the entire cosmos flows downward from the singularity of God in these successive stages. It's like a waterfall of being. First come the pure intelligences, then the celestial spheres, and finally, at the very bottom, our physical world.
So a tiered, waterfall-like creation model.
Precisely. And Averroes argued that this concept of emanation was utterly fallacious and completely foreign to Aristotle's actual surviving works. For him, Avicenna wasn't interpreting Aristotle. He was replacing Aristotle's logic and physics with this mystical cosmological system.
So Averroes saw himself as correcting the historical record.
He did. It sounds like an internal battle over the true inheritance of Greek thought. If you follow Avicenna, you're following a synthesis, a blend. If you follow Averroes, you're a purist. You follow the original text.
It's interesting because he even agreed with some of the critiques that the anti-philosophy theologian Al-Ghazali had leveled against Avicenna.
Yes, but for completely different reasons. Al-Ghazali said Avicenna's emanation was heresy because it wasn't in the Quran. Averroes said it was simply bad philosophy because it wasn't in Aristotle.
He also tackled this huge metaphysical issue, the relationship between existence and essence. Now, this sounds very abstract, but it has huge implications for how you understand what reality even is.
It's highly technical, but let's try to make it concrete. Avicenna held what we called the distinction between essence and existence. For him, essence is what a thing is. It's blueprint, dogness or chairness. And existence is just an accident that gets added to it later.
Like having the architectural plans for a house, that's the essence, and then actually building it is adding the accident of existence.
Perfect analogy. And Averroes completely rejected that ordering.
He argued the reverse.
Absolutely. He said you don't start with a pure essence that then accidentally becomes real. Something is. It exists, per se. You can only figure out its essence, its blueprint, through a later process of abstraction and examination. For Averroes, existence is the primary reality. Essence is what you derive from that reality.
That's a deep, deep disagreement. This wasn't about minor textual points. This was about the fundamental nature of reality itself.
Right. And Averroes' goal was just to strip away all this metaphysical complexity that had built up over centuries and return to what he saw as Aristotle's clear, empirical, common-sense logic.
And that commitment to intellectual honesty, regardless of the source, is summed up so well in that famous quote from the sources.
It is. He wrote that if wisdom has been previously inquired into, it behooves us to seek help from what he has said. It is irrelevant whether he belongs to our community or to another.
That declaration, that truth is truth, regardless of the faith of the person who found it, that's the hallmark of the rationalist spirit that defines his entire body of work. So this philosophical work, as we discussed earlier, was happening in an extremely hostile environment. The whole project of philosophy was under fire.
Very much so. Most notably from the Ash'ari theologian Al-Ghazali, whose work, The Incoherence of the Philosophers, was this massive attempt to just dismantle the entire structure of Avicennan philosophy and accuse its followers of, well, non-belief.
And this political and theological pressure is the necessary context for Averroes' most important standalone work, Fasl al-Maqal.
The decisive treatise on the harmony between religious law and philosophy, written in 1178. And this was not just a defense of philosophy, it was a counterattack.
His central thesis is monumental: the compatibility of reason and revelation, that they can coexist.
He argues they can do more than coexist. They must agree. Because, as he says, truth cannot contradict truth. His argument was so elegant. If revelation from Scripture and reason from philosophy are both valid paths to the one ultimate truth, then they cannot ultimately conflict with one another.
But, they inevitably seem to conflict, especially on these big cosmological questions like the creation of the universe. So what did Averroes say about handling those clashes?
This is his most radical move.
No.
He says that if the conclusion you reach through rigorous, demonstrative philosophical reason appears to clash with the literal text of Scripture,
Then what?
then the Scripture must be interpreted allegorically. The literal text, by necessity, must yield to the proven truth of reason.
Wait, let's slow down on the implications of that. Traditionally, the religious scholars, the ulama, held the absolute authority for interpreting Scripture. By making the literal text yield to the rational conclusion, Averroes isn't just defending philosophy. He's fundamentally challenging the entire religious establishment's intellectual power.
He is shifting the entire burden of interpretation. He argued that this difficult duty of allegorical interpretation falls only to those rooted in knowledge, which is a phrase he takes directly from the Quran.
And for Averroes, who are the people rooted in knowledge?
The philosophers, the masters of logic. He created a hierarchy of understanding, and he placed the most rigorous intellectual method philosophy at the absolute apex of religious scholarship.
That's a heavy burden to claim, and as he found out, a potentially fatal political position to take. And he went even further. He argued philosophy wasn't just permissible, but an active religious obligation.
He actually issued a fatwa, a formal legal opinion, suggesting that philosophy was likely an obligation, or wajib. His logic was simple and, he argued, rooted in Scripture itself.
Oh,
The Quran frequently calls on believers to study nature, to reflect on the world, and he asks why. Because the deeper your empirical and rational study of nature becomes, the more profound your knowledge of God, whom he calls the artisan or the maker.
so if God commands reflection, and philosophy is the most rigorous method of reflection, then the serious study of philosophy is, in effect, a religious act of worship.
Precisely. It completely turns a theologian's critique on its head. He's saying, you must do this to be a better Muslim, provided, of course, that you have the intellectual talent for it.
And to make this system manageable for society, he formalized his famous three modes of discourse, which define how different people can access truth.
Yes, and these modes are defined by their logical rigor. At the bottom, you have the rhetorical mode. This is based on persuasion, using imagery, metaphor, arguments that are highly accessible.
And that's the Quran's primary mode.
Averroes says yes, because its message has to reach the common masses, the fisherman, the farmer, the merchant, in order to guide them to salvation. It has to be persuasive.
Okay, then there's the middle ground.
That's the dialectical mode. This is based on debate, using plausible opinions and arguments that are often probable but not absolutely certain. And this, crucially, is the method used by the theologians, the ulama.
So he's saying they're good at debate, but their method can only achieve high probability, not absolute certainty.
Exactly. And that brings us to the pinnacle, which is only for the elite, the demonstrative mode. This is based on pure, necessary logical deduction and demonstration. It yields absolute, certain knowledge.
The exclusive domain of the philosopher.
The exclusive domain of the philosopher. By classifying the theologian's method as merely dialectical, he intellectually undercut their authority, stating they simply couldn't achieve the highest level of truth.
He also applied this rigor to defining God's nature, especially in his work, The Exposition of the Methods of Proof. He found a lot of flaws in the standard proof for God's existence used by the various Islamic sects.
Yeah, he criticized the prevailing cosmological arguments, arguments based on cause and effect or contingency, as being logically unsound or at least vulnerable to philosophical attack.
So what did he offer instead?
He presented two arguments for God's existence that he claimed were both logically sound and aligned with the clear purpose of the Quran, and these were teleological arguments.
Arguments based on design and purpose. So cosmological asks, why is there something rather than nothing? Teleological asks, why is everything so perfectly arranged?
That's a great summary. His first was the argument from providence. He looked at the fine-tuning of the natural world, the orbit of the sun, the predictability of the moon, the location of rivers, the precise environment humans need to flourish. Averroes argued that this vast systematic arrangement suggests a creator who is deliberately concerned with the welfare of mankind. It points to a benevolent designer.
And the second argument?
The argument from invention. This focused more on the micro level, on worldly entities like animals and plants and their complex internal systems. He said these things appear so clearly invented or fabricated, exhibiting a design and function that just can't be explained by accident. Therefore, they necessitate a designer who is God.
So by focusing on observation and purpose, he's grounding his theology in the empirical reality that Aristotle loved.
He is. And he even tried to moderate one of the most volatile theological debates of his time, the pre-eternity of the world. As we mentioned, Al-Ghazali used this very issue to accuse philosophers of outright unbelief, of kufr.
Averroes stepped right into that fire to cool things down.
He did. He argued that the difference between the two positions, whether the world was created from nothing at a specific moment or whether it has existed eternally, was subtle and nuanced. It wasn't nearly severe enough to warrant a charge of unbelief.
So how did he reconcile the idea of an eternal world with the Quran's description of creation?
He argued the conflict was mostly semantic. He pointed to Quranic verses that mention pre-existing entities like God's throne and water, suggesting that something was eternal. His final conclusion was that the Quran implies only the form of the universe. Its present arrangement and structure was created in time, but its underlying existence has always been connected to God.
And he basically told the theologians to back off.
He sharply criticized them, the Mutakalimin, for addressing these complex cosmological questions that, in his view, only truly belong to the advanced domain of philosophy. He was carving out a rational middle ground.
Now, Averroes wasn't just a philosopher. He was a scientist and a political theorist. Let's look at his pioneering work in these other fields, starting with political philosophy, where, as we said, he had to rely on Plato.
Right, because Aristotle's politics was missing. He was commenting on Plato's The Republic, and that meant he had to interpret it within his own cultural and religious context. He synthesized Plato's ideals with the structure of the Islamic State.
So for him, the ideal state had to be based on Sharia.
It had to be. And he interpreted Plato's famous philosopher king as being the imam or the caliph, essentially merging the spiritual and temporal rational ruler into a single ideal figure.
And this interpretation also justified the use of force, didn't it?
It did. He taught that the ideal state uses two methods to instill virtue in its citizens. Persuasion, which uses those rhetorical, dialectical, and demonstrative methods we talked about, and coercion. He justified war as a necessary last resort, supported by Quranic principles, for those citizens or external enemies who could not be brought around by reason alone.
But his views on women, which he derived from his reading of Plato, are genuinely startling for the 12th century.
They are profoundly advanced. I mean, Averroes explicitly called for women to share administrative and public roles with men. He went so far as to include serving as soldiers, philosophers, and even as rulers.
That is a striking critique of his own society.
It's a massive critique. He argued that the prevailing Muslim societies of his time were unjustly limiting women's public participation, and he deemed this restriction not just unfair, but actively harmful to the state's overall economic and political well-being. You're wasting half the state's talent.
He also used Plato's model of political decay to analyze the history of the caliphate itself.
Yes, he saw the initial ideal period, the Rashidun Caliphate, as a reflection of Plato's ideal state, but he observed that it had deteriorated into less virtuous forms of government, following that classic Platonic path from a democracy rule by honor and the military to an oligarchy rule by the wealthy, then to a democracy, which Plato saw as rule by the volatile mob, and finally, to tyranny.
And he saw his own time as being on that downward slide.
He saw his contemporary political situation as being firmly on that downward slide, yes.
Okay, let's switch gears completely. His medical contributions, even though he confessed to having pretty limited clinical practice.
Yeah, he said he only treated myself, my relatives, or my friends.
Despite that, his theoretical output was massive.
It was. His major medical text, Al-Kulliyat fi al-Tibb, or Collegiate as it was known in Latin, became a staple textbook across European medical universities for centuries. It was a comprehensive treatise on general medical principles.
But inside it were some breakthroughs that truly overturned the old Galenic and earlier era of medical thinking. What stands out in terms of anatomy?
His work on vision. For centuries, the prevailing theory from Galen was that the lens of the eye was the primary light-sensing organ. Averroes may have been the very first person to correctly identify the retina as the part of the eye responsible for sensing light and color.
That's a huge step toward modern ophthalmology. It changes the entire understanding of how vision actually works.
It's a critical step. And his neurological insights were also way ahead of their time, particularly concerning complex diseases.
What are we talking about here?
Two things jump out. First, he provided some of the initial clinical descriptions of the signs and symptoms of a condition that modern physicians immediately recognize as Parkinson's disease, decades and decades before it was formally named in the West. He described the tremors, the rigidity, the gait changes.
And the second one?
His theory on the pathology of stroke. He moved away from the dominant Galenic theory, which often attributed strokes to peripheral obstructions or blockages far from the brain. Averroes proposed that strokes were caused by the obstruction of arteries directly within the cerebrum, the brain itself.
Which is remarkably close to our modern understanding of ischemic and hemorrhagic strokes.
It's much, much closer.
Yeah.
But if we want to talk about true intellectual fireworks, the single most controversial idea he ever put forward, we have to talk about his psychological theory.
The unity of the intellect.
The unity of the intellect. This is where Latin Averroism gets its name, and this is why the church condemned him so fiercely. This concept, which he lays out in his long commentary on Aristotle's On the Soul, is complex and incredibly radical.
So what was the problem he was trying to solve?
He was grappling with this fundamental problem. How can individual humans, who are mortal and made of matter, achieve universal, certain knowledge that seems to transcend any one individual?
And what was his startling conclusion about the hardware that makes this kind of thought possible?
He argued that there is only one material intellect, and the single intellect is common to all of humanity. And crucially, this universal intellect is unmixed with any individual human body. It's separate, it's eternal, and it's shared.
Okay, let's unpack that. Think of it as like a single shared cloud server that hosts all of humanity's potential knowledge.
That's a fantastic modern analogy, yes.
But that immediately raises a massive obvious problem. If we all share the same universal brain software, where does me stop and you begin? How do we account for the unique individual thoughts and experiences that make us distinct people?
That is the billion-dollar question. And Averroes accounted for individual experience by introducing a concept he called fic, or what became known as cogitatio in Latin.
Cogitatio, that's the root of Descartes. I think, therefore I am.
Precisely. For Averroes, cogitatio is the individual process that happens in our specific physical human brains. It involves the active consideration of particular things that each person has encountered. Your individual sensory input, your memories, the specific life experiences that are unique to you.
So the body is individual, the experiences are individual, but at the highest rational faculty itself is universal and shared.
That's the theory.
I can immediately see why this was so controversial. If the intellect is universal and separate from my body, it severely undermines the Christian and Muslim theological concept of individual immortality and the distinct personal soul.
Exactly.
If our best part, our rational mind, is shared, what's left of the unique you after death?
That was the heart of the critique, and that is why it was so violently rejected by theologians like Thomas Aquinas. It threatened to render individual moral responsibility indistinct, or at the very least, highly questionable.
Okay, and finally, let's just touch upon his work in astronomy, which was driven by his commitment to pure Aristotelian physics, even if it led him into, well, a conceptual dead end.
He was a very harsh critic of the dominant mathematical model of his time, which was the Ptolemaic system. Ptolemy used these clever devices like epicycles and eccentrics, basically, circles moving on other circles, to accurately calculate the bizarre observed movements of the planets.
And the model worked for prediction. It was accurate. But Averroes had a philosophical objection to it.
His objection was that it didn't reflect physical reality. Aristotle's physics demanded uniform, perfectly circular motions all centered on the Earth. Ptolemy's mathematical tricks violated that physical purity.
And he had that famous quote about it.
Yes, he famously declared that the astronomy of our time offers no truth, but only agrees with the calculations and not with what exists. He wanted an astronomy where the physics and the math aligned perfectly.
He tried to lead a reform, but was he successful in fixing it?
He ultimately confessed that he failed to resolve the inconsistencies between the observed heavens and the requirements of pure Aristotelian physics. He said he lacked the time and the knowledge. But his philosophical demand for physical reality over purely predictive math deeply influenced later astronomers in Al-Andalus, like Nur ed-Din al-Batruji.
And he still used observation to make important points.
He did. He used his own observations, like the fact that the star Canopus was visible in Marrakesh but not up in Spain, to provide more empirical evidence for the already established theory of a spherical Earth.
So we have this massive intellectual figure, a judge, a doctor, a philosopher, whose works were literally burned in his home country because of political expediency. And yet, he becomes the commentator. So where did this monumental influence truly take root?
Paradoxically, it flourished in the West, in the Latin Christian world. You have to remember, after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, vast portions of Aristotle's corpus, the very foundation of Greek philosophy, have been lost to Europe.
And Averroes' commentaries were the key.
They were the essential intellectual apparatus to reintroduce Aristotle to Western Europe. He essentially handed them the keys to their own classical past, along with a detailed instruction manual.
The translation efforts began in the early 13th century.
Yes, in earnest. Notably by a man named Michael Scott, starting around 1217 in places like Paris and Toledo. And because the commentaries were so comprehensive and so definitive, Averroes was simply known in Latin Christian writings as Octoritas the Commentator, as if there were no other.
And his writings quickly ignited an intellectual firestorm. They gave rise to this whole philosophical movement known as Latin Averroism.
A movement centered in the major universities, particularly Paris and Padua, and it included major figures like Sigurd of Brabant. And these thinkers took Averroes' core rationalist principle that reason must be followed wherever it leads, and they applied it fearlessly.
They pushed ideas that seemed to directly contradict church doctrine, like the pre-eternity of the world, and of course that single universal intellect.
And this pure rationalism drew immediate and fierce condemnation from the Catholic Church.
Of course.
The church authorities saw this as an existential threat to revealed truth, and it all culminated in the 1277 condemnations by the Bishop of Paris, Etienne Tompier.
He targeted 219 specific theses,
many drawn directly from Aristotle and Averroes. He specifically banned teachings like that the world is eternal, and that there is only one universal intellect in all men. It was this desperate attempt to curb the tide of secular rational thought that was pouring into the universities.
But this clash also led to arguably the most important synthesis in Western thought, the work of Thomas Aquinas.
Right. Aquinas, the preeminent Catholic theologian, desperately needed Aristotle's logical framework to build Christian philosophy. He relied heavily on Averroes' interpretation to even understand Aristotle, but he fought tooth and nail against the Averroist conclusions that contradicted faith.
He wrote a whole treatise against it.
A detailed critique specifically targeting that psychological doctrine, titled On the Unity of the Intellect Against the Averroists.
So Aquinas basically used Averroes' scaffolding, but he tore down the roof and walls to build his own house.
That is a perfect way to put it. He appropriated the method while rejecting the most politically and theologically dangerous results. But even with these high-profile condemnations and critiques, Latin Averroism was incredibly resilient. It persisted in university halls, especially in Padua, well into the 16th century.
Now let's contrast that with the reaction in the Jewish tradition.
The Jewish reception was immediate and overwhelmingly positive. Averroes lived at the same time as Maimonides, the most important medieval Jewish thinker, and Maimonides received Averroes' texts and just praised them immensely.
What did you say?
He said he received lately everything Averroes had written on the works of Aristotle, and that Averroes was extremely right.
Wow. Coming from Maimonides, that's a huge endorsement. And it meant his works were translated into Hebrew almost immediately.
Extensively, peaking in the 14th century.
Wow.
Jewish thinkers, including major figures like Gersonides, they saw Averroes as this crucial, reliable bridge between Greek intellectual tradition and monotheistic philosophy. They just didn't have the same theological resistance that the Christian church did to many of his rationalist ideas.
Okay, so back in the Islamic world where he was from, his immediate impact was surprisingly quite modest. Why was his reception so muted compared to his global reach?
The sources point to two main reasons. First, geography. Al-Andalus was the far western fringe of the Islamic civilization. It was distant from the big intellectual hubs in Baghdad, Cairo, and Persia.
And the second reason?
The Avicennan school of philosophy, the one Averroes fought against, was already deeply dominant in the East. So Averroes' insistence on a purer, stricter Aristotle, it felt a bit like a throwback to scholars who were already engaging with newer philosophical trends.
So he was mostly dormant in the East until much later.
Correct. He only experienced this massive resurgence, a kind of cultural revival, during the 19th century intellectual movement known as Al-Nahda in the Arabic-speaking world. Modernizing Muslim thinkers engaged with his works, seeing his emphasis on reason and the harmony of faith and philosophy as a powerful indigenous inspiration for updating and strengthening the Muslim intellectual tradition.
His enduring recognition, though, is really sealed in the Western cultural canon. I mean, it spans centuries.
He's a permanent fixture. You look at Raphael's magnificent fresco, The School of Athens, painted in 1501. Averroes is depicted prominently. He's wearing his green robe and turban, and he's peering out from behind Pythagoras. It symbolizes his role as the essential link to classical wisdom.
And while Raphael was respectful, Dante Alighieri gave him a less flattering, but still very recognized placement.
Yes. In Dante's 14th century Divine Comedy, Averroes is described as the man who made the great commentary, and he's placed among other virtuous, non-Christian thinkers like Saladin in the first circle of hell limbo.
So, not eternal punishment, but still outside the saving grace of Christianity. But it signifies his importance.
Absolutely. He's also referenced by Chaucer in the Canterbury Tales as one of the great medical authorities.
And even in modern literature, he remains this figure of deep contemplation. I'm thinking of that Jorge Luis Borges short story, Averroes' Search,
which fascinatingly features his attempts to translate and understand Aristotle's poetics when, in his own culture, there was no tradition of live theatrical performance to reference. It's a beautiful story about the limits of cultural translation.
And the fact that we have a moon crater, an asteroid, and even a plant genus, Averroa, named after him, it just underscores the magnitude of his intellectual footprint.
He remains the primary symbol of that rigorous synthesis of law, science, and philosophy.
So what does this all mean for us? We've traced the life of a man who was a chief judge and court physician, a master of law and medicine, whose philosophical brilliance led to his works being burned. Yet, by securing Aristotle's place, he became one of the essential sparks that reignited the intellectual engine of Europe.
He defined the boundaries between faith and reason and offered groundbreaking insights into everything from women's roles in the state to the structure of the human eye. And his legacy really comes down to that radical tension he explored, the tension between the individual self and universal truth.
And for you, the listener, you've heard about his most controversial concept, the unity of the intellect. If we are to believe Averroes, if there's only one universal material intellect that is shared by all of humanity, does that fundamentally reframe our understanding of individual thought and collective consciousness?
Or is our unique self, our moral identity, truly found only in the cogitatio, that individual process of active consideration and experience of the specific things that only you have encountered? That's the deep dive you get to continue on your own.